So Lloyd sent us a message that said, if you need a bit of a warm-up repository to look at, I'd be interested in hearing your opinions on a persistence package I've been using in my template. Make sure you're on the v4 branch if you're hunting around in the repository, though. There's a package, then there's a server implementation, and there's also a client implementation. So I think right now we're looking at the package.
Yes.
So it looks like this is a presence tracking service for the BEVR stack. What is this? Let's look. BEVR is the bun, effect, Vite, and React. I like it. I guess this is a template repository.
Yeah, I'd assume so, yeah.
All right, so let's take a look. So this particular package exposes an effect service that tracks connected clients, manages status updates, and publishes events through a pubsub. So it looks like you can get access to the service. You can generate a client ID, add a client to the service, and set the status. And then, yes, it looks like we have the server and client implementations as well. All right, let's take a look. So probably won't go into the domain stuff too much. We'll just look at the service shape. So it looks like this particular service exposes the pubsub directly, which has the presence event type. I think we actually do need to go into the domain package. All right, let's see. So the presence event type in the service here looks like it's just an alias of the WebSocket event type, which comes from the domain package. So if we look at the domain package here, this WebSocket event looks like we've got 4 events. We've got a connected event, which is the initial connection acknowledgement with the assigned client ID and a timestamp. The broadcast when a user joins, broadcast when a user's status changes. I guess client status is a enum of different statuses. And an event that's broadcast when a user disconnects. Right off the bat, one thing, I mean, this is domain modeling, so I don't want to really get too much into this, but you could make these timestamps date time UTC instances, because effect schema's date time type, I think, does have encoding to a string. So this way, when you send over the wire, your date time would be encoded as a string, and then when you actually decode it back on the client or server, you'd be working with a date time type instead, which might be a little more useful, a little bit more information there. So that's one thing you could do to improve this event. But let's take a look at how it's used. We've got our client ID generator. We've got a method that adds a client, method that removes a client, method that sets status, and then methods that get in clients and subscribe. Again, right off the bat, I would make these not lazy. Whenever you see a thunk that returns an effect, most of the time that's a code smell, because effects are inherently lazy. So calling get clients multiple times, even without the thunk, would give you a fresh array of client info. It would rerun the effect. So this is a very simple thing, but also if you guys want me to clone this project and open it up in an editor, I can do that too. Just let me know. Yeah, Mattia, what's your opinion on
I would agree, unless, and I don't think so that's the case for subscribe method, but the only case that would make sense, I think, for that again is, as we said last time, if you plan on future proofing that API, because you expect maybe in the future that you have the get clients method having optional parameters of having, for example, a filter that says get me only the busy clients, get me only the online clients. I would say that unless that's the case, but that's just future proofing, having like a lazy effect, a lazy stream, or whatever usually does not make any sense. Again, unless it's future proofing. You are saying, yeah, I know that this API eventually will have those methods, and I'll provide this API as of now just as the defaults that I will add eventually to this method.
I am cloning this down so we can
Yep.
navigate a bit easier.
Yep. And also, that's something that probably we could discuss later. Probably again, maybe I would split the client ID generator into its own thing. Because if the scope of this service is tracking presence, I would say that probably, for example, on the server side, you would not like care about generating client IDs because that's something that happens on the client, right?
That's I gotta go to git checkout. What was the name of that branch?
It was
v4 migrate.
yeah.
Chore v4 migrate. Next shell mix packages. Whoops. Shell mix packages bun. All right. Resonance. Yeah. So for generate client ID, I think having a thunk here is fine because obviously it's a synchronous method. Like you want a new client ID every time. But here I think like we haven't even looked at the implementation yet. But I think like one concrete like improvement you can make is this, because again, these thunks are just unnecessary for the majority of cases. And then again, if you have an effect with never and never in the second two type slots, you can just omit them because they default to never. So those are like two cleanups we could do right away. But let's look at the implementation. So when the service gets built, we log that we're initializing the presence service. One thing you could do here, and I think this is like a good practice in general for logging, tracing, etc. Like in the, especially if you're doing it as part of like the build of a service, is one to give the log level. So I think that log defaults to info.
Info.
I think. I forget. But I think a good practice is to try your best to set the level of your logs, because then like you can easily turn on and off logs just by including a layer at the very end of like your layer graph. So you could like provide the, I'm just going to address this because I feel like more people are going to ask, but Homie mentions 99% of effect users being blocked upgrading to V4 because of the drizzle support. Again, I think 99% is a little dramatic. I don't think 99% of effect users are using drizzle. I think there's a subset of users who might be blocked. But again, we're not maintaining the drizzle integration anymore. It was much too much maintenance overhead for us in V3, which is why we dropped the package in V4 and we're letting the drizzle team maintain an integration. So you folks are going to have to wait for the drizzle team to have a V4 version out. I think that they're working on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. I think there's like maybe snapshots or something like that that the drizzle team is already working on. So you might be able to try it out already. But anyway, I just wanted to like nip that in the bud because I don't want to hear it anymore. Anyway, we dropped
Yeah.
Keisly too. Yeah, we dropped both because again, the drizzle team has been wonderful about working with us. The Keisly folks are also great, but we just didn't have as close a relationship with them and weren't able to establish as close a relationship. So the Keisly integration has fallen by the wayside. If somebody wants to pick it up in the community and do it, that's fine. But the effect core team won't be maintaining a Keisly integration anymore. Same thing with Drizzle. The Drizzle team is maintaining an effect integration now. So anyway, back to this thing. So again, I think like putting a log level on here is useful because then at the very root of your application, you can imagine like you have like your declare const main layer, right? Which is a layer, I don't know, we're just going to say of never for now, but you could imagine this contains all your services. Then at the very root of your application, like if you wanted to, for example, like temporarily turn on debug logging, right? If this was like a debug log, this won't show up in production if you have your log level set to info. But then if you want to like temporarily turn it on, you could have either a layer or just like a simple, I think it's in logger dot minimum. Maybe it's in layer dot,
Yeah.
or maybe references. Always forget minimum log level. So you could set the minimum log level in another layer, right, to something and provide it to your whole layer graph. So you could have, for example, like an effect that, for example, might get the log level from the environment. This isn't going to compile 100% yet. We can make it. So this will give you like the log level from the environment. So you can imagine if you're deploying on a particular platform, K8's deployment provider, whatever, you can pass in a log level to control this. And then you could return a layer dot succeed. Sorry, succeed context references dot minimum log level, and then set this to log level. I forget if there's like an easier way to do this. Somebody can tell me the combinator I'm missing if there is. Atia.
I would have remembered about like setting a current log level. There was in V3, but maybe I confusing myself with V3. There was a set log level.
We may have removed it because it's
Mm,
so easy to set
yeah,
up a minimum log level now in different ways. But
yeah.
like you could do literally just succeed like this instead. And if you provide then this like log level layer to your main layer. So if you do like, effect dot provide main layer dot pipe layer dot provide log level layer, now your entire application has the log level set to whatever you passed in from your environment. So if you're explicit about this, it can be really nice because then you can just swap at the environment level or at the configuration level which log level you want to be running with. And yeah, I think this is an underrated thing is to like specify this. Plus, oh, and then the other thing I wanted to mention was in addition to this, I think there's also something to be said about annotating your logs. So one thing that I've seen people do is at the very end of the constructor here, you can pipe off the end of the constructor and do annotate logs. And you could do, for example, like service, presence service, right? And now every single log that you do in the constructor, not in the methods, right? The methods are their own effect. They're not attached to the constructor effect scope of like log annotations. But in the constructor, any logs that you issue, like if we were to see this debug, then it would also have a log annotation associated with it with the presence service. Like, so you can clearly see like this is originating from the
Mhm.
presence service, right? And you can also add other things here, like if you want to add span annotations and things like that. But I think this is kind of like an underrated thing, um, but could be really useful in production.
An example that
Um,
we have here, for example, is that also we have things in the service like the I thought I remember seeing generating in the service a client ID for itself. Yeah, client ID dot me. Oh no, sorry. Yeah, it is an effect. Sorry, I thought it was something built when the layer was constructed. Never mind.
So let me just see. In addition to specifying the log level, I tend to annotate logs. There's specific pattern best practice I should be using. Yeah, Matthias, I'm sorry. I sort of answered your question as you were typing it, but yeah, I think annotating logs on the service constructor can be really useful for adding metadata to these messages that show up as your service is being built. Because then, like, you can imagine as your app's being initialized, you'll see initializing present service, but maybe you don't even need this anymore, right? This log kind of becomes redundant if you just do this or something. And then if you have annotate logs with the service name at the end, this you don't even really need present service in there anymore. So you could instead of having a like I'll say like semi useless log in there, which is just saying we're initializing, you could log something else out here, like, I don't know, maybe how the present service is being configured, if you have configuration parameters coming in. And then like the annotations would indicate which service is actually being, which service is being used. And again, you can attach whatever metadata you want to the logs. With effect.fn, are logs also annotated with the tag? They wouldn't be. So let's take add client as an example. If we call add client somewhere else, we would not get the log annotations that were attached to the constructor because those logs are scoped to this constructor effect. Effect.fn does not, correct me if I'm wrong, Mattia, but I don't believe by default it adds a log annotation with this. So you'd have to do it yourself, I think.
Yeah, I think so as well. I think it only adds the span for the invocation.
Yeah. So this is specifically for tracing in effect.fn and for like stack trace management as well. It's not for logging. So you would have to specifically like annotate, effect annotate logs, blah, blah, blah in here. Well, let's see. So there was an interesting tangent into just like logging with effect, but I think it's like just an interesting pattern that I don't see enough people leveraging. So anyways, we have a client ref that's being created here. We have the pubsub, which is a sliding pubsub of events. So we only keep the most recent 1,000 events in the pubsub. And then we have a client IG generator, which I guess just delegates to crypto, which is fine. Add client updates the ref by adding the client to the map. Let me actually quickly scan this because I think this is another thing I see frequently that I don't think is super necessary, which is using a ref inside the service constructor. If this is never exposed from the service at all, you don't need a ref here. It's just additional overhead. You could just use the map directly and then get rid of like all these update calls. But let me just see if the ref is exposed. Ref.get, ref.get, ref.update. Yeah.
It is just internal state, yeah.
I think you could entirely remove this ref because again, number one, effect.gen internally uses effect.suspend to make sure any state that's allocated inside the generator is safe and allocated lazily. And number two, because JavaScript is single threaded, unless you're passing the ref like around outside the service, right? Like if you're passing this ref into another service and you don't necessarily know what that service is going to do, obviously you don't want a mutable map in that particular case. You think you return it in the get clients? Let's see, get clients. I think you just map it directly
Yeah.
into the values, which again, you could, if you're doing data conversion, if you're not returning the mutable map directly from this service, if everything happening to that map is internal, there's really no need to have the ref wrapping it.
Mm.
I think that the having a ref around a particular data type is most useful when that data type is being passed around between services or by other parts of your application. If it's all internal to the service, if all the management of that like reference is internal to the service, most of the time you wouldn't need a ref. You can just have mutable state inside the service. It's not like a rule, right? There are situations where a ref might be necessary, but like in this particular case, I don't think you need a ref. Let's go back to the top. And feel free, Mattia, if you see anything I don't see, to
No,
let me
I
know.
would say that whatever you said is just perfect. I would just add that probably it's maybe more connected like to this specific use case. It could be interesting, but that depends on the API you want to give. In here, maybe to use a subscription ref rather than a ref if you care about sharing like that availability of like having like a subscription you can subscribe to have the changing list of the clients, but in here a ref does not make sense. It is internal, it is mutable state that it's not shared as you mentioned, so it does not make any sense in here, I'd say.
And it looks like the majority of the rest of this service is just state management. So publishing into the pubsub. Yeah, this is all just kind of cruddy app. Yeah, see this. No good.
No good. Yeah.
No good, Lloyd.
No good.
This should be using, if you're going to keep timestamps as numeric, you should be using the clock here, because this would break tests. Like it would be non-deterministic in tests. If you're using the clock, then you can get deterministic events in your tests. And again, if you're using datetime, which uses the clock under the hood, you get a full datetime value.
And I would just add to this, but maybe that's more my personal preference. If we go back to that generate client ID that we have seen on the top, I would basically argue the same thing for that crypto generate random ID that we have seen before, because having this inside of the implementation of the service is basically making a service that could be reused as is in tests into something that cannot be used in tests, because again you have then that random UUID in your way. So I would either, as I mentioned before, probably extract away the ability to generate a client ID into another service, or make this generate client ID something effectful so that you can inject, for example, a different random implementation. But that's my preference. Again, it's not a rule, it's how I see it.
No, it's a good call out. You could definitely have like an ID generator service that presence service depends on, and it could even be an optional service, right? Like
Yep.
it could be something that you provide in tests, but by default just uses crypto. So yeah, I think that's a good call out as well. Let's keep going. Scroll through all of this. Why subscribe? What is this cast going on here?
Ooh.
So I would fix this by doing this. Now, having said what we said before about the thunky effects, there is, I retract the statement that you should never use a thunk that returns an effect, because there is one concrete use case for doing that, which is if you are using effect.fn to get call site tracing set up. So if the goal is for you to have the ability to do call site tracing, like this right now, wouldn't really work well with call site tracing. I mean, you have a static effect here, but you're not going to know necessarily where this was declared. You're only going to get the span for where it was used. But if you want both call and declaration site tracing, that is one argument for having like lazy effects wrapped by an effect.fn. Even so, like we toyed around with making everything that we export from effect like lazy by default. I don't know, every static method like effect.void, etc. We toyed around with making them all like that you'd have to call them as functions to be able to benefit from that like tracing. But I don't know. I think that I tend to not leverage this maybe as much as I should. I tend to just make this like a static effect. But
Also,
so what's
the reason why I think as unknown as the casting was in there was because using pubsub subscribe actually introduces a scope, and if we look into the signature of the exported service, the scope is not there.
yeah, you're
Yeah.
right. Scope. Ah,
So that was a cheaty way to introduce a bug.
yeah.
because
That's a.
because when you sorry.
I was gonna say that's a pretty big bug actually.
Yeah.
That means the subscription would never get like cleaned up.
Cleaned up, yes.
So this right here, this cast, uh, loses the fact that this requires a scope. And the other thing is, oftentimes when I have like a service that's exposing a subscribe, I don't really expose the subscription. I mean, again, this is just my preference, but I tend to
Yeah.
stream.
From pubsub.
Where are you, stream? Okay.
Yeah.
I tend to do this because, like, I mean, I don't know about you, but 99% of the time when I consume the pubsub, wherever I consume it, I'm turning it into a stream anyways. And by doing this, making it a stream here, number one, I can embed the scope in the stream. So you see here now, this stream doesn't require a scope because streams are resourceful by default. So when the stream ends, the scope would be closed for this pubsub or for the subscription. Sorry. I tend to do it like this. I think there are options here, maybe. Pubsub array. Am I making up the fact that maybe that was a v3 thing? But anyway, I tend to do this, but
yeah, I definitely agree with that, and that connects to one other thing that I would basically raise is that having a service that exports and makes public both the pubsub and the subscription to the same pubsub with the same shape, in my opinion, does not make any sense, because you can basically just subscribe directly to the exported pubsub where you care about that. It could
yeah.
make sense if you had, instead of exposed the pubsub, exposed a method to basically emit events, like a way to offer elements into the pubsub, or if you had that subscription emit projection of what's being like emitted by the pubsub. For example, I mentioned before, it could be interesting for this service to have a subscription ref of the list of connected clients, and maybe offer a subscription that returns something you can subscribe and get the evolving list of connected clients. But generally when I see both the pubsub and the subscribe, my mind stops for a moment and thinks, okay, is it a legit operation to expose the pubsub? Because usually that's not the case. But if that's the case, that means that probably we don't need to expose the subscribe as well, I would say. And
That's a
again,
good
just
call
a
out.
personal preference.
No, it's a good call out. And rethinking this service around like a subscription ref could be interesting as well. Because if you have, like, if the whole point of this pub sub is to subscribe to these events, like a subscription ref could be interesting, but
I would have used, for example, a subscription ref with maybe an hash map, given we are using something that comes from schema and already has the equality implemented in it. It could be interesting, for example, a subscription ref with an hash map instead of a regular map. And that way you can export as subscribe something that returns to you an immutable hash map that gives you at that moment which are the connected client with their info.
yeah, even further, you could have, like, we can actually sketch it out, right? Like,
Yeah.
if we have a clients map, which is a hash map make, oops, why can't I do that? Oh.
Client ID, yeah. Unresolved. Oh, yeah, because it's the value, yeah. Client info. It's empty, probably not make. Yeah.
This is my brain on a Wednesday morning. So we have a hash map now, and we can do subref. Let's just call this for now subscription ref make. And to Mattia's point, because hash map implements hash equality under the hood, anytime the client's map changes, so we add a new element, we change an element, whatever, the subscription ref would emit a change. So the nice thing about subscription ref is that now subref subscription ref we can call changes to get a stream of changes over the subscription ref const events or changes maybe.
And that would be what we probably expose as a subscribe method.
Or even further, like you could say, like let's just say we have this stream. Your service then could expose methods like, right? Like imagine this is the return value from your service. You could have events where you do a stream dot. Why can't I? Oh. So changes dot pipe stream dot map. Right. And you could take this map and you could convert it into and then you could do whatever else you want here as well. Right. So like sorry, stream dot map. Man, do we not have a map iterator? Map array? Is take an iterable or an array? Okay. I mean, you get the idea. Like you could project the stream into different things. So you could like, go ahead, Messia. Sorry.
For example, one exact use case about that is that in that client info structure, I think I saw, if we jump for a second to that client info definition, I think that we saw there the client ID as well. And we are already keeping the client ID as the key of our hash map, for example. So it does not fully make sense to have a copy of that on both sides, basically. So, for example, one could keep in the actual subscription ref as value of the hash map just those two fields of status and updated at, and then use that stream.map to construct those client info again with the projected value if you don't return the hash map with the client ID being the key. Because again, single source of the state, then you could have subtle bugs where the key is now different from the client ID there's in the value, and then not great.
The heck is the name of this thing? Status. Yeah, so now you could have like a stream of status changes. So every time the map changes now, you'll get a new event emitted from this stream. So down like from the service, you would actually consume the you would consume this stream, and every time a change happens, you would see it. So there's some interesting stuff you could do here. I think a subscription ref based approach makes sense. Because then you can get rid of the disconnect between like the map and the pubsub. The only thing is, the subscription ref give you the ability to control.
I would also that would also, I think, remove probably, but that's depend on the domain. Remove the thing of having like a pubsub that actually is holding those 1000 items we have seen before, because ideally you already have like the projected state exposed in the subscription ref. So again, that depends on the domain, but I could see that 100 events being replayed when you subscribe to the pubsub maybe not being necessary anymore, because again, you have an updated projection that you can query immediately and then subscribe for what will happen next.
Yep.
But again, depends on the domain. If probably there are some use cases where you care about those, but usually I wouldn't say so.
Yeah, because I think that we don't give the ability to customize the pubsub that's created under the hood with subscription ref. I think it's always an unbounded pubsub with a replay of one.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think it's an interesting alternative design to this that you could like take a look at.